Hey gang, what's going on? This is Nate on the Stone. Welcome back to my channel and to the 48th episode of The Rolling Stone. Now, if you watched my video on Tuesday, our regular On the Stone video, you might notice that there's going to be a little bit of overlap between the end of that video and this one, okay? But there's a reason for it, because there's more that I can say about that particular topic. And that particular topic is the reaction of several notable people on the right in regards to state and local governments taking actions against the coronavirus, okay? So, for one example, Mayor Garcetti of Los Angeles, he announced a moratorium on the city from March 15th through March 31st, which means that places like restaurants, bars, libraries, museums, gyms, I believe, they are now closed, okay? For the rest of March, they are absolutely closed. The city government basically said, you are going to close, right? Please shorten your hours, and do it however you think would be best. No, it was just a flat out no. You guys are going to close. This is going to be closed until the 31st. Well, some people, I have seen several notable people on the right say that this is out and out tyrannical. Okay? So, Jacob Airy, who is part of the Daily Wire, he said on Twitter, in regards to Mayor Garcetti's announcement of a moratorium on the city, "This is terrifying. Telling people to self-quarantine is one thing, but abusing your power to force private businesses to close is tyrannical. In a month, maybe more, we'll be saying what an overreaction this executive action was." And then he later went on to say that conservatives who were okay with this were out and out communists. Okay? That's what he said. If you're a conservative, like moi, who thinks that, when the equation has changed, with a global pandemic, then reactions need to change as well. That makes you a conservative. Jacob Airy would think that I'm a communist. Okay? So that's what he was saying. Now, Jeremy Boring, also of the Daily Wire, I'm noticing a pattern here. He's a producer of the Wunderkind, Ben Shapiro Show, Michael Knowles' show, Andrew Klavan's show. He said, in regard to Mayor Garcetti's announcement, "These useless little wannabe tyrants we elect mayor have been waiting their whole lives to wield this kind of power." Okay, Liz Wheeler from One American News said also on Twitter, "Fascinating to see which conservatives are totally fine with mayors and governors shutting down private businesses. It's one thing for government to recommend social distancing. It's an abuse of power to dictate private enterprise to stop." Okay, and these were the same sentiments that were also expressed, not exactly the same, but they were the same sentiments. They were sentiments in the same vein as were expressed by Charlie Kirk and Candace Owens over at Turning Point USA. So there we have it. Okay, it is tyrannical. It is an abuse of power, and these wannabe tyrants who've been reading Marx and Lenin and Hitler and Mussolini, they've been waiting their whole lives to do something like this, which could be true. Okay, I don't know. Maybe Mayor Garcetti does have a secret diary saying, in the event of, a global pandemic, I will be able to do X, Y, and Z. I don't know. Maybe he does. It would be fascinating to find out. But here's the problem with that. Okay, here's the problem with that. In the first place, it's not tyrannical. I'm just going to put that right out there on Front Street. This is not tyrannical because it is coming from the state and local level, right? The Constitution, it enumerates the powers for the federal government. Okay? And it specifically says in the 10th Amendment that all powers that are not expressly forbidden to the states nor expressly given to the federal government are retained by the states. There's nothing in the Constitution which says that state and local governments cannot take actions like this again with the caveat that there actually is an emergency happening. Okay, I want to read you just a little bit from a piece from Reasonmagazine.com, which was written by a man named Keith E. Whittington. Okay, and I want to give a big shout out and a big hat tip to my Facebook friend, Brandon Blake, who actually tagged me in a post where he actually, he tagged me in the post where he shared it to his Facebook timeline. So a big shout out to Brandon for actually making me aware of this article, which was like, water in the desert, okay? Because it just, it congealed and solidified exactly what I had been thinking on this matter, and even more importantly, it gave us some historical context. That's what this piece does, okay? So this is what Keith Whittington, writing for Reason Magazine, says about this, and the title of the piece is just wonderful. Can the government just close my favorite bar? And Keith Whittington says, yeah, it can. Okay, this is what some of what Keith Whittington says. Quote, a key constitutional foundation of the American system of federal powers is that the national government is one of the enumerated powers specified in the text of the written Constitution, but that state governments are ones of general jurisdiction, which hold the residual of public power, lacking only the exceptions that have been specifically carved out by written constitutions. Traditionally, this doctrine was known as the police power, which was conventionally understood to include the power of the state to make all necessary laws to protect the welfare, safety, morals, and health of the community. This general background of police powers underwrites myriad routine restrictions that state and local governments put on social life. It is what allows local governments to authorize health inspectors to examine the kitchens of restaurants and order them to close if they discover problems. It's what allows fire marshals to limit the number of people who can occupy a public venue. It is what allows police officers to arrest people for urinating in the street. It is what allows government officials to prevent you from just accumulating mounds of garbage in the backyard of your suburban home. It is what allows government officials to tell you that you cannot keep a Bengal tiger as a pet in your house. It is what allowed states to ban freestanding billiard halls or bowling alleys as contributing to public disorder. So, okay, break here. All of these things. So this is, as Keith Whittington says, is just another exercise of the state. Again, not the federal government's, but the state's exercise of its lawful police powers, right? Which is charged because the state is charged with maintaining, as he says here, the welfare, safety, morals, and health of the community. I mean, that's one of the reasons why men form political communities in the first place, right? Because nature out there is nasty, brutish, and short, to quote Thomas Hobbes. And so that's why, for that reason, and because men are political animals and we are naturally drawn to political society, that's why we actually make civilization in the first place. Okay, now, to continue on with what Keith Whittington says. Notably, American courts long insisted that the police powers limited as well as empowered government officials. Legislatures possessed a lawmaking power to act in the public interest, but they could not properly be understood to possess a lawmaking power to exercise public force to advance favored private interests. My sometimes co-author, Howard Gilman, has a magnificent book outlining the rise and decline of the police powers jurisprudence that state and federal courts once used to emphasize the constraints on government power. Courts once emphasized that state legislatures could not, under the guise of the police powers, simply declare that a previously lawful business was now illegal and all of its inventory was now contraband that could be seized by the government. Courts informed legislatures that they could not simply prohibit individuals from pursuing their non-noxious vocations in their private residences. While governments could, in the name of public safety, regulate whether bakeries maintained unsanitary conditions in their workspace, they could not regulate how many hours per week a baker could work. States often enough abuse the police powers, and courts frequently do not stand in the way of such abuse. It was also the police power that underwrote progressive eugenics measures like the forced sterilization of those deemed mentally deficient by the state and racist measures like the ban on interracial marriages. But the larger point is that American constitutional jurisprudence has long recognized a vast authority on the part of the states to regulate private social and economic activity in the name of public welfare. And then he actually goes on to list historical events where this actually happened. So, for example, he says, when incorporating the village of Brooklyn, the state legislature of New York authorized the creation of a, quote, Board of Health, empowered, in the case of the prevalence of any such pestilential or infectious disease in any part of the village, to enclose and shut up such infected part, so as to prevent all intercourse therewith. The state of New Hampshire authorized the local health officers to remove any person infected with the smallpox, the malignant cholera, or other malignant pestilential disease, to some suitable house, to be by them provided for that purpose, and make such regulations respecting such house, and for preventing unnecessary communication with such persons or their attendants as they may think proper. So, what that means is that yes, states can and have abused their police powers. Okay? It has happened because man is fallible, right? Goes back to what James Madison said. If men were angels, there would be no need for governments. If men were ruled by angels, we wouldn't have any need for constitutions because everything would be perfect. But, simply because things are abused does not mean that you cannot take lawful, legal, necessary steps to protect the public, especially, and I will re-emphasize this point again with my dying breath, especially when the equation has changed, okay? Mayor Garcetti, okay, in Los Angeles, I don't particularly care for the guy. No, he's a flaming ideological progressive. Absolutely. He and I don't know if there's a single point that he and I would agree on, okay, politically or philosophically. However, Mayor Garcetti did not just, make an announcement on Twitter on March 14th and say, yeah, you know what, Los Angeles, we're going to have a moratorium. So, private businesses, you guys are shut down until the 31st. Why are we doing that, Mr. Mayor? I don't know. I just felt like I wanted to be a wannabe dictator today. No biggie. It's California. What are people going to do about it anyway? They're used to it. He didn't do that. What he did was he reacted to a global pandemic, okay, that has now killed thousands of people around the world. Okay, that's what they're reacting to, and that is the point that really needs to be emphasized. A, that this is perfectly legal, it's not tyrannical at all, and two, it's because the situation has changed. So what this really shows, this really gets into something, okay? It really, really shows how the right has failed. And I hate to say that because I proudly identify, as a conservative. If you've listened to my videos for any length of time, if you've watched me or anything, you know that I am a conservative. Although I do like to say, now the more I pick up, and the older I get, I like to take a page out of Mark Stein's book, and a little bit, because I like to say now that I'm an 18th century conservative who's about 300 years past his sell-by date. That's what I am. So I don't fit in very neatly with most of today's conservatism, that's true, but I do identify as a man on the right. I do identify as a conservative. So it really gives me no pleasure to say that this is an indictment on the right. So the real question we have to ask ourselves is, why have these mayors and governors felt the necessity to make these decisions in the first place? And the answer, unfortunately, is because people can no longer rule themselves. People can no longer govern themselves. People cannot change their behavior and their way of thinking to meet with new situations. In other words, they can't adapt. Okay? If you watched my video on Tuesday, I showed and read out some of these sentiments, right? People boasting on social media that they had actually not just gone out, not that they had just decided to ignore social distancing, i.e. avoidance, but that they had proudly taken an extra 30 minutes at the restaurant, right? Because this is America and people can't tell me what to do. And this idea, if that idea was cemented in my head when I posted that video this past Tuesday, it has only been strengthened. Okay, CBS, they interviewed a bunch of college kids who, as per tradition, were going down to the beaches in Florida for spring break, right? And I just want you to listen to what some of these kids were saying. When they were asked by the reporters, okay, this is what some of these kids said. Here it is.
If I get corona, I get corona. At the end of the day, I'm not going to let it stop me from partying. You know, we've been waiting for Miami spring break for a while. About 2 months we've had this trip planned. 2-3 months. So we're just out here having a good time. Whatever happens, happens.
Like, it's really messing up with my spring break. What is there to do here other than go to the bars or the beach, and they're closing all of it? It's really messing. I think they're blowing it way out of proportion. I think it's doing way too much.
Doing us bad. We need a refund. This virus ain't that serious. It's serious. It's more serious things out there like hunger and poverty, and we need to address that.
Yeah, I mean, we planned this a long time ago, and it was kind of up in the air if we still go, but like we're here. I just turned 21 this year, so I'm here to party, so it's kind of disappointing, but we're just making the most of it. We met these other people in our little Airbnb spot, so we're just hanging out with them and trying to get drunk before everything closes.
I mean, it sucks, but we're gonna make the best of it. We're enjoying ourselves. It sucks, and I'm from New Orleans, so this really sucks. However, we're gonna enjoy ourselves. We having day parties all day. It's my birthday, St. Patrick's Day. Turn up.
We're just trying to roll with we're just living for the moment. We're just gonna do what happens when it happens. When stuff closes, we're gonna do it when it closes. But besides that, we're just trying to have the best trip we can.
Yeah. It's one of those things that really has to be seen and heard directly to be believed. That's why I added that clip in there. But, you know, and this is not just some college students, you know, who are complaining about not being able to go on a wild spring break, right? No. There have been, for example, millennials and Gen Zers who have been calling this the boomer remover, right? Basically saying, you know, boomers, baby boomers, you ruined the world for us, so now we're not going to practice social distancing. And if we get the virus and if we give it to you and if you die, well, tough toenails, okay? Because you ruined the world for us and now we're going to ruin the world for you. Okay, that's been a legitimate thing actually in the world today, as I have seen on social media. And it just proves Burke's axiom, Edmund Burke's axiom. I've said it several times here on the channel, right? When Burke said that men's passions forge their fetters, and that if you can't control yourself, then someone outside of you will have to control you instead, because otherwise the whole thing falls apart into anarchy. Right? Those are the only two options. Now, how does this indict the right? Well, because for years and years and years now, the right has not really talked about moral development in people. That's seen as a very taboo subject, honestly. It's seen as very Victorian, it's seen as very stuffy, it's seen as antithetical to freedom, right? It's seen as very square and uncool, and I've probably made myself square myself using that terminology. But that's really one of the reasons for it, right? And we've seen this before. Oh, you don't want to be against you don't want to be against drug legalization, right? Because then you're standing against freedom. And that's the worst thing that you can do as a conservative today, is standing up against freedom, right? Who wants to stand up against freedom? Who wants to be seen as a stick in the mud? The same thing was said for, when people started twisting themselves into pretzels, saying that redefining marriage was the most conservative thing in the world. And other people on the right were saying, oh, wait a minute, what? This is kind of a reversal. People were saying, oh, you don't want to stand against freedom, right? No one should be able to stand against that. What are you, against love and fun and everything else? And it's the same thing happening here, okay? You don't want to stand against freedom. You don't want to stand against fun. You don't want to seem square. You don't want to seem authoritative or anything like that, because then what happens is that people won't like you. And when people won't like you, then you're going to lose votes. That's always the kicker. We can't talk about this because we might lose votes. We can't talk about this because we might lose votes. And we might lose votes because people might think that we're a bunch of puritanical, black-wearing sticks in the mud. And so the right has, more often than not, kind of shied away from those sort of topics, from those sort of things. They'll talk all day long about the free market, which is great. And sometimes, every now and then, they'll make some sort of a head nod to virtue. I remember in 2018 when I went out, coincidentally, to Los Angeles to attend my first Politicon. The speaker of merit at that time, kind of the main event on Saturday, was Ben Shapiro, and he gave a talk. And the second part of his talk was about virtue. I even made a whole video of it, actually, way long ago, back in 2018, when this channel was only a few months old, right? So it's not that they will never ever talk about virtue or morality or things like that, but it's always done very shallowly. It's always done kind of blink and you'll miss it. They'll never really dive down deep. They'll never really also kind of sort of follow the logic. They'll never follow the logic. And that's why, because now people on the right, people now can't govern themselves because no one has told them that they can govern themselves. I mean, the general culture out there isn't telling people to govern themselves. No. I mean, it's a massive free-for-all out there, and the right, which is supposed to, in the words of William F. Buckley, supposed to stand atop history and shout, "Stop! Don't go here!" They've neglected their duty. They really have. This has been a dereliction of duty on the right. So, I hate to say it, but in large part, the governors and the mayors making these decisions are because the right neglected its duty, right? Mainstream conservatism failed the country because it didn't talk about this. And they're right. You know what? Today, no one really wants to talk about these things. No one really wants to actually engage with those ideas of authority and order and justice and, freedom of excellence instead of the freedom of indifference, which I'm sure we'll be talking about on the channel here one of these days, the differentiation between those two. It's a fascinating topic. No one has wanted to do that. And it's difficult, like I said. No one has wanted to do it because it is difficult. And then you have to think, well, how are we going to argue for this? How are we going to do this? How are we going to do that? I'm not saying that it's not difficult, but it was something that needed to be done. It was something that needed to be done, but because they didn't want to make anybody mad, because they didn't want to lose subscribers, because they didn't want to lose revenue, which again, legitimate concerns, but because they didn't want to do that, they didn't talk about it. And when they did, it was a very blink, you'll miss, very skimming along the surface. And now, when those ideas aren't even in the public square anymore, and now, when we really need those ideas to be there so we could tap onto them and say, hey, wait a minute, you know what? Circumstances are changing. We need these ideas now to kind of preserve society. You know what? We're all interdependent upon each other in society. That's why we've decided to live here in society instead of off on our own and be islands of ourselves in the mountains or in the desert somewhere. Now when we need those ideas, they're not there. Okay? And so that's why, as terrible as I say it, the right's the right's embrace of atomistic individualism, where, you know, they're not going to say, except for the most horrendous things, this is wrong and that is right. And if you don't like something, well, just don't do it, or just don't watch it, or just don't sponsor it, just don't buy from there, etc., etc., etc. And now that has become the norm on the right, no one is going to think of anyone except themselves. We don't even have that in our minds anymore, socially speaking, okay? On an individual level, it could be very, very different. But, because I know several people who have said, you know, I'm avoiding people. I don't want to spread it. I don't want to catch it. I don't want to spread it to other people. But societally, right? Societally, we've been unable. We can no longer think in that way anymore. And so, because we can't govern ourselves, now these mayors and governors have to step in and do the job for us. That's what this really shows. It's not an example of tyranny. It's an example of how the right has failed. That is story number one.